Hello. Hi, Liberty.
Hi.
I'm so excited to chat with you today. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for taking time to meet with me and have this conversation. It's something that I've been looking forward to the past couple of days.
Yeah, me
So
too.
grateful that you're here.
Yeah.
So I'd like to start off by asking, what is your favorite way to introduce yourself?
Ooh, that's hard. That's actually really difficult. You didn't tell me you were going to ask me that. I think I like to introduce myself. Um, well, it's funny because you know what? I don't even know if I have a good answer to that because I think depending on the circles I'm in, I love to talk about to talk about and learn about art. So I think that one comes the most naturally. I'm also a wife and a mother and a teacher, and
Mhm.
I wish I could travel more than I do. So a world traveler, you know, all these different ways that I could describe myself, but I don't know if I could come up with one particular way that made it feel like it was definitely me, right?
Isn't that how it goes though? We're all so multifaceted, and with someone like you who has so many different skill sets, and I love how you move through different communities in such beautiful ways as well. So yes, I can imagine it's very difficult.
Yeah, I think
She's
there's
like, who am I?
you know, there's a good I think that's why sometimes I lean into the artist terminology because I think of
Mm,
myself not I think an artist, if you're really living like an artist, um you're asking questions, and it's more than what you do. It's a way of looking at the world. So I think
mm-hmm,
that's why that word fits me the best. Um
mm-hmm.
because it implies that I'm thinking about certain things too. So that's probably
Yeah.
why I lead with that one when I think about it.
I love that. Could you say a little more actually about um, how is it that with your, I don't know if you want to use the word calling, vocation, whatever you want to call it, with you being an artist, how does that actually help you to view the world in a slightly different way? You know?
Um, I love that question actually because I gave a talk last fall um, about how I felt the job of an artist is to keep wonder alive. And the reason
Mm,
I landed on that is that I was thinking what makes an artist really. And a lot of people, because I was actually speaking to a group of creatives, not all of whom would call themselves artists, but all of whom were working in a
mhm,
creative field. And so I wanted them to come away with the sense that, like, they are indeed artists. And so when I think about being an artist, when I was preparing for that talk in general, I was actually just thinking, like, to be someone, like, all the things that I have encountered where they have felt like real art, whether or not they're positive or negative. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I'm looking. My phone just locked. And sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. Um,
Good.
whether or not they're positive or negative, they come to the question has been asked. You know, I wonder what. You know, I wonder what would happen if this, or I wonder. There's a lot. I've been thinking a lot about asking questions lately, and so I think it really started with my preparation for that talk where I was talking about as an artist, what makes an artist, what makes a piece of art. And to me, what that is the willingness to ask those questions, and wondering is what, in my opinion, separates an artist from someone who's just gonna, like, keep doing the everything the same every day, you know,
Mm,
driving the same way to work, always wearing the same kind of uniform. I think anyone who's driving the
mhm,
same way to work and wearing the same uniform, who is also looking at things and wondering about them, is going to be that kind of person who is creating, whether or not it's a tangible thing, but they're creating. So I think of them as a creative.
mhm,
Does that answer your question?
mhm. It does quite
Okay.
beautifully. What comes to mind when you're talking about this is the word curiosity. And I feel as though wonder does it better, but just so that, I could throw in a different term here, but um, I definitely feel as though part of the artist's role is to exactly what you said, like stoke the fires of curiosity, to keep this sense of possibility before the public, um, as a way of saying this is not all that there is. This isn't the only thing, the only way that things can be. There are other alternatives if we just look at it from this angle or this perspective.
Right.
And so I love this use of the word wonder. Brings to mind curiosity, as I said, and just a sense of um, presenting to the public an alternative, whether or not you agree with the alternative.
Right.
It's just to
Right.
say here's another way of like viewing it,
Yeah.
which is like the most beautiful segue into what I'm about to say. But really, today, what I'm excited to chat with you about is one of the tracks on the EP, Afro Bombs, which we'll get to a little bit later. But really, what like the EP is doing, what Blk Halos is doing overall, is exactly what you said, trying to stoke the fires of wonder, stoke the fires of curiosity, to say here's another way of viewing things, and it's the sound is very. People have described it as like atmospheric,
Hmm.
a lot of different,
Like ethereal,
it's
I
a
thought.
little bit hard to place in terms,
Uh-huh.
ethereal, that's a
Yeah.
great word. Yeah. It's hard to place in terms of genre, and that's
Yeah.
intentional. We're not trying to necessarily um, lock it into something that has already been done. We're asking how else might we cultivate this sound of what we're trying to do, cultivate this otherworldly kind of sound. And so I love the phrasing that you've mentioned as the role of the artist. So I want to talk more about your practice before we jump into Afro Bombs and the EP. So tell us about what you do. I know a little bit, but
Yeah, well,
tell
I describe
listeners.
myself as a fiber artist. I'm actually mixed media artist. I do all sorts of things. I draw, I write poetry, I do collage, I do many different types of art. But right now, I'm really focused on and sitting in my studio, which is really zeroed in on fiber and textile arts. I love the gathering process. I love the binding
Mm-hmm.
together and the visible mending and the action of sewing as a painting tool. Um, there's a huge part of me that is always collecting discards and going down to like the tiniest little scraps and finding a way to include them and to not like there's a part of me that's very ecological and like yeah I want to be zero waste, but a lot of it also has to do with this desire to honor even those smallest pieces. And so it's led me in a lot of different directions. I started off as a textile, like right out of college, I started off as a textile designer that was very corporate. I saw a lot of actual waste happening, which was what made me aware of that. And then I went off of that, learned how to sew and learned how to quilt, which was a very tedious art form and very rigid also. And so I spent 10 years learning how to do it and then had to like figure out which parts of that am I keeping and which parts of that am I releasing and like letting go of so that I can be an artist in this art form. So I think I would describe myself as someone who's very inspired by nature and culture and people and story. I'm moved by the stories that textiles have before they've gotten to me, whether they've been worn by someone or created by someone. Um, they have a very long history, so I'm very much interested in history as well and how textiles both hold stories and can tell stories. So I create quilted paintings, really, or I say sometimes I call them textile paintings.
I love that phrasing. Textile paintings, quilting paintings. It's beautiful. You said a couple of things that I would love to touch on. But first, let me say I definitely resonate with what you're talking about regarding the storytelling aspect of
Mm-hmm.
textiles. The exhibition of Blk Halos, like the actual physical exhibition, is primarily textiles, and so I definitely resonate with what you're talking about. And I was intentional about doing it that way because I was thinking of sort of ancestral
Yeah.
legacy and what's a way for me to connect with my ancestors and my roots, even if I don't quite know exactly like where I'm from. The story with a lot of Black Americans is that we don't know the fullness of our
Right.
history. I mean, it's hard for anybody really to, but specifically within Black American culture, there's like gaps,
Yeah.
within the story. And so, but exactly what you're talking about with the history of textiles. I always use this example, but I can never remember the name of the book. Um, I wish I could. But basically, the author was saying that textiles are mankind's oldest form of technology.
Oh,
And I just find that so
yeah.
fascinating,
Yeah.
like so incredibly fascinating that hundreds of years ago, our ancestors were weaving things and making clothing and making other things that they needed to use, for daily living. And that was why I wanted to lean into textiles, because I was like, I want a way to connect with my ancestors, doing something that they may have
Yeah.
done. Obviously, their looms may have been
Yeah.
different, the materials slightly different, but just this idea of weaving in and out is something that has carried across through generations. And of course, with what you do, quilting is a little bit different, but it also has like such a long
Yeah.
history,
Yeah.
right? Um, so I just want to say I definitely resonate with what you're talking about there. But you said a couple of things that I would love to touch on. You talked about really like the phases that you've gone through as an artist to kind of get to where you are. And you're one of those super humble people who Liberty's quite amazing for anybody listening. Seriously, go follow her on Instagram. She's doing so many amazing, beautiful things, and she's super calm and like humble about it, but like really incredible things are happening right now. Museum show, and then also like some magazine features, just like really beautiful, incredible blossoming
Thank
happening,
you.
But you mentioned like different phases of your art practice, that I would love to lean into a little bit more, because you use this phrasing of determining what to keep and what to
Yeah.
release at certain phases. And so I would just love to hear you talk a little bit more. Like, how do you decide what you're going to hold on to and what you're going to say, this was a useful skill for this particular time, but I no longer find it helpful.
Oh, I think that's so good because that shifts all the time, right? So like what works for me right now
Mm,
also is not going to work for me maybe in 10 years, maybe not tomorrow. So a big word that we have in our marriage actually is sustainable. And yes, I do sustainable art, but
mm,
we talk about sustainable on a life level. And so a lot of times
mhm,
we'll look at things and say, oh, this is not a sustainable pattern. This is not something I can do long term. This is something I don't get a choice about, being a parent. I have to be a parent long term. So
mm,
that one's never an option, but there's aspects of things. So I learned to incorporate that into my practice too, right? So what currently is not sustainable is for me to be doing a lot of my mixed media work. I don't have the space for it. I have this giant,
mm,
beautiful studio, but it's filled with all these textile pieces. So I'm allowing the paint and that kind of mixed media stuff to sit to the side. I may pick it up again later. Um, the when I'm looking at my practice and I'm going, what needs to change? A lot of times it's when things start feeling maybe like predictable that I start getting itchy.
mm,
So I think that's just sort of my
mhm,
nature. I start being like, oh, I know what's next with this, or, that's one of those tricky things because I currently am in a pattern where I have a lot of commissions and people like my style and then they come and they say, I want this. And so those pay
mhm,
the bills. So those actually are sustainable,
mhm,
even if I want to keep pushing myself. So like a current place I'm at right now is saying, okay, where what parts of that do I keep and what parts of that do I let grow? And there's this
mm,
wonderful verse that says, can't remember, I think it's Nehemiah, that says, do not despise the day of small beginnings. And I'm
mm,
super protective about my small beginnings. So if I learn a new skill or if
mm,
I'm suddenly interested in a new thing, I'm very, very protective of it. I don't share it with everyone. I don't give it away for free because I feel like you would never like take a little tiny sprout and put it out in a big windstorm. Like it's just not appropriate because it's not strong
mhm,
enough to withstand it. So I try to create space for little things to bloom and grow. I've got little side projects and things I'm messing around with on the side and taking breathers. I do in between my big commission projects, I always try to do something for myself, whether it's fun or something that I want to like wear or whatever it is, but I try to make sure that I'm still exploring things. So I'm not always just in this one path on the one direction. Definitely keeping things coming and going. because that's been what allows me the freedom to find a new direction, to explore thought, let something get to rest. I have a really good girlfriend who always described it as, she's like, I have to unclog that drain, because if I don't unclog those ideas, then it'll get so clogged that I won't have room for more. So just this idea of like, if I have all these ideas over here, then I need to continue to process them, even if it's just one at a time. After every, big commission or something like that, I just try to process a little one at a time. Then that keeps that other flow happening, even if I can't always sit in that flow. I mean, you know this, like there's a lot of times where we would all love to be artists where we're just sitting in a room making art all the time, but you can't do that. There's so much work you
Of
have to
course.
do about like getting it out there and talking about it. And, those are great things, but it's just a lot of work too. And so, for me, it's trying to figure out that exact balance of, keeping the stuff that has to be going, making sure I protect, I have rent to make, so I have to do that. But I also always want to keep something I have this entire board like right next to me right now. This one is like my nonsense board. It's just like anything that's inspiring, I just throw it up there, and things happen, and there's things that just sit there for years too, and that's okay. So part of my like sustainability or tossing things out, those kind of things, is being able to look at this wall and go like, oh, I think I'd like to touch in on that right now. Now I'm finally ready. That's kind of ready to happen. So yeah.
So good. All right. Yeah. Several points again that I that I would like to touch on. So good, because I don't know that this conversation around sustainability in creative practice is spoken about enough. Sometimes I feel as though, because there are a lot of pieces to this, it's not just making your art. I do feel like a lot of artists find themselves in burnout or just in creative frustration because they're trying to like turn the wheel all the time, like pumping out material and like getting pieces out, but then also doing the marketing and also like trying to foster collaborations. And, it's just quite a bit. And I feel as though what you've managed to cultivate is a space for you within the mix and the flurry, which I think is amazing. I think that space might look different for each artist, but I do think it's very important to have that, and to build that into your rhythms of public facing work and just what are you going to do for yourself, what if you just create something just for you without it having to be posted on social media? What if you just made a few things just for you? I think that's amazing. And I think it's definitely something that needs to be cultivated and talked about more. Just because I find a lot of creatives, they reach these points where they just get exhausted. They want to keep creating, they want to keep doing, but it's like, a machine. At some point you have to pause, you have to breathe. And so I really love that. I think it's such a good word. And then you talked about the verse that says, despise not the days of humble beginnings or small beginnings, whichever translation you're using. I think also this has far reaching implications as well. Usually my mind goes straight to like, not straight to, but I'll say it's always has like one eye on the macro level, social level. Like how can we apply like what we're doing within our creative practices on a broader scale that impacts like communities and our society as a whole? And so when I think about you talking about despise not the day of small beginnings, I do also think about the social implications, especially around matters of race, identity, areas where you've worked within, and I'll touch on that in just a second. But I want to make this point because I think it's important to hear. I think sometimes when we're doing this kind of work around race or advocacy, just social justice, whatever it might be, whichever terminology you prefer, there's this, depending on whom you're talking to, right? There's this sort of desire to find the quick fixes or do the thing that's going to eradicate racism forever, and then poof, it's done. We don't have to worry about it anymore. But that's just not the way it works, right? It's really all about these series of very small steps and continuing to move and build and build and build and build. And so that movements can culminate towards like actual change. And so I love that verse. I love that verse in its application in terms of creative process as well as social process. And I like to link the two. And the reason why I'm linking the two is because I want to talk about how we met a little bit. So Liberty and I met through an organization called Break. Break is an organization that I'm the director for, and we host a residency program that meets at the intersections of art, race, and faith. And Liberty was one of our first residents. And she was amazing.
It was so good. It was so good.
I want to talk a little bit about that because the themes that you're touching on, even with your creative process, but then also social implications that stem from our creative processes, is exactly what Break is about. And so let me just preface this by saying Break is after, like its mission, if you will, is to basically inspire artists to reconsider their roles in social healing. And what we mean by that is, so say someone like Liberty, who has a very beautiful practice of mending, as she's mentioned, of pulling these different smaller pieces together to form a beautiful whole. How do we encourage Liberty to take her process and to share with her community so that they in turn can share with their communities? And it's just this idea that artists already have the sort of creative energy that's needed for social healing. And so what we're after is actually just helping people to continue to expand their view about what's possible with what they do every day, in their studios, in their homes, wherever they're making things. So Liberty, share a little bit about what Break was like for you,
Oh,
the
it was
Break
great. I mean,
residency.
it was really timely. I mean, coming in on the front end, we were, I think there were still riots happening like right as we were starting. It was really, things were really
Yeah.
raw, and I was feeling especially helpless and lockdown and COVID stuff. And so I came in
This was in
2021. Yeah, early
2021, by the
January
way.
2021.
Yeah.
So so I was feeling really helpless, honestly, as far as like what can I do? I mean, I don't even know what to do. And
Mm-hmm.
so I had been honestly, as a white woman, looking for healthy ways for me to process my disappointment in what was happening, but
Mm-hmm.
without making that be a burden on other people. And so I turned to my artwork and began just a small series, not for anyone else, but just for me, about like my feelings about what was going on. And I began to express my angst and frustration and my wonder, and through these very simple quilts. I think one thing that whenever I think of you, Dia, I think of how I feel like you're the person who taught me that it's okay that the way I process things is in very small bites. Like I have this uncanny
Mm-hmm.
ability to make everything accessible to a preschooler. And so sometimes in very intellectual settings, I can feel intimidated because I think I distill them down so that I understand them till it's very, very small pieces. And sometimes I think in an intellectual setting, I can be intimidated by people who use big words and all that. And one of the beauties for me of being an Inbreak, we were having these big conversations, was your encouragement. They're like, oh, Liberty, that's actually a gift. So what happened with my work
It is.
was I came in and I was like, I don't really know what I'm going to do or how. And you were like, oh, by the way, there's a community aspect. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that. So, and I'm thinking, I quilt by myself in a lockdown. Like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. So, honestly, what Inbreak did was you guys really pushed me to find creative ways to connect with people and with their stories. And so, because what I was connecting with was my perception of a situation. And I thought, wow, these little things that I did that were so basic actually felt very healing to me. And I found a digital way to share that with a group of people. I'm fortunate to have a really diverse group of wonderful friends just around the world. And I invited a bunch of them to participate. And would you consider using this thing that I did to express answers to questions that you have? Specifically, where do you come from? Like, where have you been? And where do you hope to be? And what my friends sent back with these digital versions, just images of what they had done with these little pieces that I had given them of triangles. They were just black and white triangles. What they sent back to me were these stories that were so profound. I was like weeping as I'm reading them, going, oh my gosh, I have been given something. It was like I was entrusted with these stories and the depth and the level. And I still, whenever I talk to them, I'm like, you guys don't know what you did, where you entrusted me with like really big stories. Like they could have kept it really surface level. And it was just a testimony to the quality of these people that they were really willing to go that deep. And they told deep, important stories, which I then was like, oh my gosh, I can't just sit here with these stories. Like they have to be shared. These are important things. And so what I did was I took their stories and their little paper triangles, and I turned them back into textile based pieces. And I put together a huge body of work that's over 20 pieces. I could do more. There's been like a couple hundred made now, but and we put on a show, which was amazing. And I think my favorite thing response to it was um, when Mike said to us, he said, "This is an empathy machine." And I thought that's exactly what I wanted, because well, like when the opening was happening, people, you could just see people interacting with the pieces, leaning in close to read those stories and to experience it. And it was just so beautiful, because what I learned during that process was that I work in this medium that is really comforting. And people think of like cuddling up with a quilt, and none of these are cuddle quilts. They're all like on the wall. Some of them are too small to cuddle with. However, there's a naturally comforting thing about the textures of cotton and wool and thread. And in that way, and in the way that honestly my friends and participants verbalized what they were telling in their stories, we were able to talk about some very difficult things in a way that was just about listening, just about standing in someone's shoes, just about being with them in that moment of what their answer to that question was. And so it feels to me like something that was, I never imagined it would get to that level, to get to the place where I felt like it was its own thing, and it has become that now. So yeah, I feel really passionate about it because I feel like the custodian of this gift.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about what's happening with the project now. But before we get there, I want to hopefully fill in a few of the gaps for those who maybe don't quite understand like what happens within quilting or what the project itself is. So back to the beginning of this story, Liberty referenced like the pandemic, and 2021 was just off the heels of George Floyd's murder and the protests that been happening in 2020 and carried over into 2021. And so what we did throughout the residency is we gathered. We had 4 residents, and then there were 3 people on our team. So the 7 of us would meet weekly, all online, because everybody was kind of in different places across the United States. And what it was is it became a place of processing, like processing matters of race and how they intersect with our faith journeys, and then also each person is an artist, so how it's being incorporated into our practices. And first and foremost, it was really about what's going on within each of us, right? Before we could even begin to share with the public or share with our communities what's happening within each of us. And what Liberty was talking about with her particular practice, the way I remember you describing it is that you just started working in with very simple methods using these little triangles. And so correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understand it is that quilting, a lot of times you're working off of a pattern, and sometimes you can form those patterns using like paper that you're kind of maneuvering. And so from paper cutouts, the way that you begin to kind of determine what you're going to do with fabric is you'll just start off with like a paper template. And so Liberty had these, she used something that's very common in the quilting circle, which is a triangle, little paper cutouts of triangles. And she basically was like moving them around and finding her own patterns that she was using to kind of express what she was feeling. And so it's a very visual, very tactile way of processing what was going on and during the pandemic. And then, of course, it's not just during the pandemic, that came from somewhere, obviously. And so the beautiful thing about that project and that process was that when Liberty described it, it just seemed so accessible, like essentially anybody who has access to a printer can cut out these little triangles, print them out, cut them out, and then move them around to make their own patterns, which is what Liberty invited people to do. And so the way that she guided their kind of ways of thinking about what they were going to form with pattern, she did like an online workshop. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about the questions that you asked too, if you remember them, because I do think um, you asked the right questions for people to feel comfortable to tell the kind of stories that they did tell, because the stories that were shared were, like you said, very personal. They were about identity, but they were specifically about roots, heritage, for a lot of people, not everybody, but other people spoke about what it means to be whatever their particular race is in this particular moment, and so you had to have asked the right questions to even like produce those
Yeah.
kinds of stories. And so, do you
Yeah.
remember the
I
questions
think the
that you
first one
asked?
was really like, how did you get where you are? That generally speaking, most of us are not in the place that our ancestors are from. Talk about that journey or tell a
Mm-hmm.
story about that journey. So that was one of the first questions. Um, the second one, gosh, now I'm feeling maybe it was just the three of them. Maybe it was the second one was what are you grieving? And then the third one
Mm-hmm.
was what are you hoping for? And that was tricky. The hope
Mm-hmm.
one was the hardest one for people to do. To be really honest, it's much easier to name what hurts you than to visualize what you would like to see.
Mm-hmm. This is like such a good point because I feel like with Inbreak and even in the work through Dia Studios, like the art installations that we're doing, it's that part that we want to cultivate, because I think you're right. I think um, after you've gotten a certain amount of education and after you've cultivated your senses to be able to recognize issues and to name them accurately so that you can communicate with others about what's happening, the next step is, okay, well, we know what the problem is. What do we actually want to see? And I do find that there are times when it's difficult to articulate um, what you want to see. And I think the reason for that, not for everybody, you know, just to say that, not for everybody, but I do think that um, that sense of imagination is exactly why we really wanted
Yeah.
to work with artists, because artists are constantly taking materials that are in existence and saying, what's going to come of this? And they have a way of being able to walk through the process, even if they don't know what's to come of it. They have a way of trusting the process and moving through the process so that something new can be birthed, right? Like that's the energy that an artist brings to their craft every single day. And that's what we're after, like pulling out and cultivating through Break specifically, but also, in the work that we're doing with these studios. Um, it's that imaginative capacity that we're after, and it's always towards the sense of there's something that wants to be birthed. How do I craft it, cultivate it, paint it, quilt it? How do I help this thing come into the world? And I do think that artists in particular um, have the gift of being able to share that
Mhm.
with others, because sometimes people get stuck in that phase of exactly what you're talking about, of I see the issue, but I don't know what to do about it. I don't know where to go next. I don't know how to process this trauma. But if you talk to an artist, they can help
Yeah.
you to navigate that. So that's exactly what Inbreak is about. Um, and I would love to hear a little bit more about whether or not you found it difficult to kind of wrestle with the hope element, and if so, why?
Yeah, I
You know,
laugh because I'm the only person who's gone through the whole thing who's never done the hope one.
ever.
Yeah, because
Okay.
I have not been able to articulate what I think that looks like. I really struggle with that. And
Mm-hmm.
like I think you and I have been talking a little bit, and honestly, this is even why I chose. Like I was thinking about that one song, Afro Bombs, that we've been talking about transcendence, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this idea of
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what hope is, right? It's transcending whatever you're in and imagining this new thing. And so, something I've been thinking about a lot lately is artists who have the ability to just come up with some wild solution for something, right? Like I was recently working at school. I'm a teacher and I was working at school on a big project and someone said, we're going to do this. And I was like, I went home and I was like, my mind is blown at the creative direction of this person. And yes, I totally found the solution and made it happen. But I was like, where did you come up with that idea? And then I realized it was so funny because it was a very practical thing, but I actually spent a lot of time journaling about it because I thought, what has it taken me to cultivate the ability to ask that question, that what if question? What if we just whatever, as opposed to the like, can I do this or this? And it's like, yes or no, rather than having this dualistic idea, right? Of like, yes or no, versus like, if I look at this plan, can I do this? Yes, no, I don't know. But if I go, what if? Then I can begin to process some solutions that maybe have not been come up with before. And I do think that is artist thinking. And I do recognize that, like what you're saying, that artists might have the freedom of thought to process things that other people are not looking for. And I'm really spending a lot of time right now thinking about that type of approach in my life. When I looked back, I was going, okay, so when I've asked myself the what if questions versus the yes no questions, that's when big change happened in my life. That's when big things happened. That's when new bodies of work came out. That's like all the big things that happened in my life were a what if and not a yes no. And so I was talking to someone about this and they said, well, what if the answer is no? And I said, but that's so funny because I already have so many no's in my brain. I don't need to entertain any more no's. I will come up with every reason not to. But what if I lean into the what if of it being yes? If I ask myself, could this be a possibility? And so I think if I'm looking into what does it look like to hope for healing, I don't know if you mind me segueing a little bit into your song, but one of the reasons why I was really drawn to that song in particular is just the talk about redlining and this conversation about, it's an imprisonment, really, right? And this conversation that we could have, like, of being imprisoned physically but also mentally, and to be able to release that. I think at the end of the song it talks about, now I'm sitting at the table, and I want to see that kind of freedom come. And I don't know, I don't want to jump ahead because I know you had specific questions about that song for me. But really,
No, you're good.
the realism for me was like, what I loved about listening to it was I thought, oh, this is my job. In this particular moment, I'm here to listen. And you've given me, by releasing this EP, the ability to make change in this however small way by listening. And that's my job right now, is to sit down and listen. And I thought, it's like on a dual level. It's like the depth of it and the depth of the concepts, but also the action of listening to it is the growth. That's a small beginning for many people, for most of us, really, is the learning how to listen, right? And so then when I start learning how to listen and I start asking those questions of like, what if everyone is allowed at the table? What is it like to transcend these red lines? What can, not necessarily, like, I'm not a policymaker. I don't have anything to do with that stuff, but I can be sitting in this aware, conscious of it, acknowledging it. And like in the work that I've done specifically in my Blk project was, how can we acknowledge the journey and heal? Because I don't think we can move forward unless we look back and we say, this is where we come from.
Yeah, you're referencing the title of the project, which is Where We Have Been and Where We Hope to Be, which we didn't say, but specifically you're referencing both components, right? Literally, what's your past? Where have you come from? And then what do you hope for? And, I find it really ironic and interesting that you struggled with that second half. Um, what do you hope for? How do you imagine that? How do you envision that? Because I see so much hope in the project that you have created. You know, I see how you have created that space for other people. And I find it interesting that you yourself are wrestling with it. You mentioned Mike from the show that we did. Mike Hernandez from our Projects hosted Where We Have Been and Where We Hope to Be, the in person exhibition in Pasadena. It was in 2021, I believe, summer 2021. He did call this project an empathy machine. And I think a lot of that came from both. You created a space for people to be heard. So, to this theme of listening, I know you meant it in a different way, but I do think there's something to creating a space for people to share their stories that is crucial, to this work. Because we each have a story, but how often do we get to a little bit of noise? Just let it go. So we each have a story, and how often do we get to have someone witness our stories? And that's what you did through this project. You gave people a chance to be heard, And then to that point of hope, I think the very act of gaining the courage to share your story is hopeful. And I also think that you've created spaces for people to not feel so helpless, to say, I can contribute something. And I see so much hope in this project. I see so much hope because it's not denying the past, but uh, it's not willing to just rest where we currently find ourselves. You're asking people to try to at least attempt to try to turn their attention towards, where do we hope to be? Like, what's the possibility here? Like, what can we create together? Like, even if we can't fully picture everything, what are we at least dreaming about? What are the hunches or the instincts that we're leaning towards? And I find that very hopeful work. Um, just wanted to say that before we segue into Afro Bombs. But one other thing, and it connects to the song as well, but you mentioned this idea of transcendence. And I would love to hear like your definition of that. I think when we hear the word transcendence, a lot of people can come up with many different images or ideas or feelings. And so, what does that actually mean for you?
Well, I really got hooked by the word. I'll be honest, I've had a hard year just on a personal level, and was finding myself just kind of wanting to stick my head down and ignore things for a little bit. And I was listening to a podcast called Makers and Mystics, and they're doing a season on transcendence right now. They're, the host said, the opposite of transcendence, or the counterfeit of transcendence, is escapism. And it just kind of twisted something in me, and I was like, oh, that's what I'm doing. I'm counterfeiting something real. And so I've spent the last, I would say, few months really leaning into like, what does it mean to be to transcend things, and to understand that like I am going through some really tough stuff right now. Like I just am, and that's just life. Life is just hard. And what is it like to be able to get past that, to get past the prisons that are somehow holding me in, and to experience real life and abundance, and to feel the wind on my face, and and also to express that through my art and through the work that I do. So I'm leaning into it right now because I need it. And I'm chewing on it a lot and thinking. And then I heard another episode in that podcast even this week where Bree Stoner was talking about how she says, well, I don't like that word because it implies that we are being held back by something. And she was talking about composting instead, right? Like this idea of consuming or like something decaying and then enriching. And I'm like, well, that's beautiful too. So like there's all of this stuff that I'm just mulling over right now, thinking so much about the experiences that I have, like what I look around and I see these things, and then what is the beauty that comes from those ashes, right? And so Yeah, that's probably the best way I can describe my thirst for it right now, is by recognizing that desire I was having for escapism made me focus in on the fact that, like, I don't want the
Mm,
fake. I don't want the fake version of this, you know?
mm, mhm. Yeah, I see a lot of that in your practice too. And I love this thought about escapism versus actual transcendence. To transcend is not just to necessarily leave behind, but it may also include elements of transformation. What is alchemy is the word that comes to mind. The sense of being able to take a material and turn it into gold, right? Like you're not necessarily leaving it behind, but it's having some sort of transformation attached to it that's going to elevate its worth, value, status, whatever you want to call it. But I love this thought that the gold is always present, even in the sort of base form. You just have to understand the necessary chemistry, the necessary process to cultivate it, to bring it out. And so I love that. And there are a lot of analogies, even in nature, this idea that the tree is in the seed. Um, Even if you don't yet see the tree form, by planting, by watering, by nurturing the actual seed, you're going to eventually see that transformation of the seed, caterpillar to butterfly, so many different, analogies we could use there. But in your practice, I see this as well. Like as a quilter, you're literally taking what might be considered scraps. I mean, you might work from like new rolls of fabric, but in general, quilting is usually thought of using scraps that hold memory, and you are finding a way of transforming those scraps, putting them together to make something new. And so I think of that as well as a form of transcendence might denote this sense of going to a higher plane, but I also think it always has its roots in material, its roots in what's
Mm-hmm.
on the ground, its roots in the fragments, if you will. And so I see a lot of that in your practices as well. Um, but let's switch over to Afro Bombs a little bit more, and you've touched on it, and so I do want to chat about redlining a bit. So Afro Bombs features Phil Allen, the great, fantastic Phil Allen. He did his spoken word on that piece, and I loved it. So I wrote Afro Bombs just as a poem and eventually turned it into a melody, like all the pieces on the EP, actually. And Phil presented Red Line, and working with the producer Alan Hampton, producer for the EP, we just thought there's something interesting here to juxtapose what he's talking about, what Phil's talking about with redlining, which is basically like zoning certain communities to certain areas so that um, essentially you're keeping whether it be the poor or particular race, class, group to a certain area, so that it's contained. And then you can develop and build and have wealth in other areas. This is a very rudimentary way of explaining this, but this has a long history in the United States, where if you go to certain pockets of certain states, but usually like the inner cities, you'll find like clusters of certain people groups. And a lot of times those people groups have dealt with a lot of poverty, and resources were divvied up around those areas, if you will, to benefit white people or the wealthy, so on and so on. Um, and Phil is speaking about that in Red Line. And so we thought it was interesting to juxtapose that story with what Afro Bombs is talking about, which is essentially um, defiance against what wants to hold, a certain people group down. Like Afro Bombs is all about, my hair is up now. Actually, I just noticed. I didn't do it on purpose, actually. But the beauty about a lot of Black hair is that we can turn it into any kind of shape. It can be smooth and lay straight, or it can just have its natural form where it kind of sprouts out and upward. And so it's just this sense of not having to be relegated to
Yeah.
like these confining areas, but actually being able to, if you want to use the word here, transcend, to move beyond the boxes that you have been placed in, right? Because our natural roots, what we have been gifted with by God, actually naturally
Mm-hmm.
defies laws of gravity. If I were to take this band out of my hair, it would still it wouldn't hold exactly the shape, but
Yeah.
it would still hold its shape. And that's just my hair, right? And so it's this sense of this explosion of blackness, this explosion of beauty and strength, right? And it being
Yeah.
an explosion of naturalness, not something that we have to necessarily manipulate, but that's just what we've been gifted with. And so we thought it was interesting to juxtapose the two. What wants to hold you down and confine you to what naturally God has given you to help you to actually transcend those limitations that may otherwise be present. You know, there's a line. So it goes, um, Afro Bombs frame skulls like royalty, the blackness of
Mm.
distinguished holiness, a royal priesthood we spring to life, roots defying gravity, eluding your gravity. And then it goes, halos won't lay chemically pressed down over rounded domes they frame, crowns jetting
Mm.
out for all
So
to see.
beautiful.
So
Yeah.
totally juxtaposing
Yes.
this idea of redlining. But let me hear more about what resonated with you. You spoke about redlining. Talk a little bit more about why that particular song
I
stood
think
out to you.
partially, I think where I live in Los Angeles, there's, we talk about that. I live in a very diverse neighborhood, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's a conversation that we have among neighbors, which is interesting. And so that's something that that I at least have done some homework on and know enough about it that I was like, okay, I'm familiar with this, but also just this, to me, it hit right up against that concept of like wanting to transcend. And like when people hold others down or push people into certain things, you're essentially taking away or attempting to take away someone's ability to transcend, right? You're holding back their spirit, you're holding back their contributions to society, you're holding back like so much goodness that you're holding
Mm-hmm.
back by trying to control. And I think that is the big sin really of redlining, is this control, right? This desire to like manipulate. And I think that's just those are such scary words to me, to be honest, like manipulation and control. And that's what that is. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
just when you think of someone being able to break out of that box, to live where they want, to move freely, to make the decisions and own a home, or like all these things that have historically been denied, I think of like, that is a hope, right? That those things are deteriorating, and that there's people able to move into spaces that they haven't
Mm-hmm.
previously been. And there's a lot of things wrong, but that is a thing that is partially being rectified, right? And so that is a hopeful thing when I think about it. And so when I think of transcending, I'm like, okay, there's a marker for some transcendence that's happening, right? That like there are spaces at the table that are being opened up. There are homes that are available. Obviously there's so much distance that needs to be covered, but at the same time, I think that's where I see transcendence, right? So like this thing that I'm really thinking about,
Mm-hmm.
and and then feeling like, what do I want for my friends of color, is that transcendence, right? That let's leave behind the darkness of that past, and let's move forward into like a new wholeness and acceptance, and a validation, and a valuation, and like an appreciation and honor. And I felt like the beauty of that, specifically his spoken word of like starting saying, I keep bumping up against it, and then by the end he's at the table and he's set free. And so I was really moved by the beauty of that. Yeah, that was what really drew me in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Phil's spoken word is so powerful, and he just has such a way with words. But one thing, we've had this conversation, I don't remember when, but we talked about that last line, this idea of
Mm.
what does it actually mean to be at the table. And I think a lot of people are kind of getting to this conclusion. A lot of people of color, why continue to try to beg people to let you at the table, whereas you can actually participate in
Mm-hmm.
the formation of a new table? And to
Yeah.
me, that's
Oh
kind of where I
yeah.
am. Like
Yes.
why, like why do we need to stress ourselves about trying to fit into a system that wasn't
Right.
necessarily designed or built for us, when we could collectively determine what kind of new system do we actually want to build, that would be
Right.
equitable, that would be accessible,
Right.
that would be welcoming
And not
to all of
systemically
us.
sick either, right?
Yeah.
Like
So
that's not like that doesn't have DNA
exactly.
of
Exactly.
oppression.
Yes. Yes. Not to replace one oppressor with another either. That's not, at least in my mind, that's not the goal. How do you make something that where even the former oppressor can find a healthy home alongside everyone else? It's, in my mind, it's not. The aim for me is not to exclude the former oppressor, just to
Mm-hmm.
help them to relinquish those tools of oppression. I don't know how actually possible that is, but that's sort of the Christian version, right, of being able to offer, not, I don't know that we offer redemption to other people, but to be able to say that God probably does offer redemption to each of us, including those of us who have participated in oppressive methods. And honestly, to some degree, each and every one of us
Right.
is implicated in this whole system, right? Like some more so than others, but the need for grace, the need for redemption is always present. And so, how do you create a table where
Yeah.
even the former oppressors can find a new
Yeah.
hope and a new way of being? That doesn't. This is like another conversation for another day, but there is something that happens to the soul, I believe, some form of twisting, some form of deprivation that happens when
Yes.
you are the oppressor. It may seem as though you are constantly in control and you have power, but something's happening within you that is separating you from the essence of yourself that I believe God has instilled in each person, this sense of goodness and wholeness and sense of righteousness. I think that is available to each person. I think assuming control and assuming manipulative postures, I think it has a way of distancing that aspect of yourself. But I don't think it's necessarily. I'm kind of like that hopeful kind of person who believes it doesn't have
Well,
to be
that
lost.
yeah,
Like,
like
is there a
that's
way for you
like
to? Yeah.
I heard someone talking about embodiment, right? That like you're right, that the embodiment of
Mm-hmm.
even being in the oppressor's space means that you've lost connection with your humanity, right? So the most beautiful
Yeah.
example
Yeah.
that I've ever seen of this is when my husband and I toured Robben Island in South Africa, and to see the former prisoners now live in their guards'
Mm-hmm.
homes, in the guards' homes, and give tour guides or give tours. And they say, this was my cell. And let me talk to you about my experience. And then
Mm-hmm.
I met him, a former guard who became, honestly, Nelson Mandela's best friend. But he also gives tours from his perspective. And it's, I mean, I was
Mm-hmm.
so like changed by this one day that I spent there, because I saw like those are people are embodying what it looks like to heal from such a deep wound, right? And there's so many things you can't get back,
Mm-hmm.
but you can move forward, right? And I think there can be a place, at
Mm-hmm.
least in that space on that day, what I saw was a space of honor for everyone at that particular table. And
Mm-hmm.
I came like home just going like, oh my gosh, like, what does that look like? Why can't we talk about everything? I want to hear, and so for me, the practice of listening has been my journey, right? I envision myself, I try to like when I'm hearing things that are hard, I picture my ears getting bigger so that I can try to absorb those painful things I might need to hear or learn, and allowing them just think of myself as like, just Liberty, just let your ears get bigger and sit there and be okay with absorbing this, because it has to be heard in order for all of us to grow. And so um it's a long journey, but I do think that as we enlarge our ears and our ability to listen and to hold those stories, that at least is the only thing I know how to do, right? Like I said, like I feel like what I do is all these little tiny things. I do lots of little tiny things, but what I do know I can do is I can enlarge my ears be willing to not always talk and to listen. And I think that's what was so fun was I was, even as I'm listening to all the songs on your EP, I was thinking about, this is it. I'm listening. I'm listening. And she's offering people the opportunity to listen, to hear something new, to hear a perspective of someone that they haven't heard, to also be surrounded by, like I said, it was very ethereal, this surrounded by this work that goes in and out of thoughts and concepts and clever plays on words with some of the different things that in some of the other songs. But I felt like that is the job. That is my job right now, is to listen. And yet you basically have made it even easier by releasing this, giving
Mm,
me the opportunity to hear more and to enlarge my ears even more.
mm. I appreciate that word, but I
Okay.
want to challenge something that you said. You said that you felt like that was the only thing that you could do was listening, and I actually definitely want to challenge that because you have been able to do way more than that, actually. What you've been able to do, particularly through your creative practice, and what I have witnessed you do several times, is to take your capacity to listen, to sit still, to hear the stories of others, and then offer that gift to another person. And so I think listening is the first step, but I definitely think there are so many other steps after that. And you've already taken the journey of going to the next steps. And so I don't want you to shortchange yourself and thinking that it's only about your listening. It's also about your capacity to create that space for others to be heard, to share, and then to offer them a creative way of being witnessed to, but then also a creative way of processing. You know, you have offered this gift to people, and I think that um, that is the sort of energy that we need more of, that sort of creative capacity to not only hear things but then to do something with it too, but not by yourself. You know, like the whole point of it is, what can we do together, what can we create together? You could not have made the quilts and pieces that the quilts that you made without the particular stories that were offered to you, right? And so it's the give and the take of both, each one contributing what they can to that particular space. And I think that yes to listening, but also yes to creative forms of witnessing, yes to creative forms of processing, yes to creative forms of collectively moving together, doing together, creating something that otherwise would not be if we weren't all trying to do this thing together, you know?
Yeah.
So I wanted to say that because you've done this.
Well, thank you. I think that the there is, when you find a partner in that, it enables that easier. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Mm,
I think that what I gained in this whole process was the partnership of people who could help me navigate how to honor what I was given. Because it is a little tricky right now to, like, specifically, I would say as a white woman, to hear things and stuff and then know how to act. So with,
mhm,
so I think the beauty of what I was offered was partnership and people willing to come alongside me and help me navigate this, because that can be the hardest part.
mhm. Yes, and I think also your ability to name that, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think sometimes some people get stuck in the sense of, oh, I don't want to say the wrong thing, so therefore I'm not going to do anything.
Yeah.
But I do think you had the courage to say, I don't know what the right approach is, but what do you think? How can we collaborate
Yeah.
together? How can we put our heads together and try to navigate this? And the truth is that there's no perfect or quote unquote right way to do this journey. It just doesn't exist. And there will be times when people will say the wrong things and
Yeah.
they will do the wrong things. But this is where grace is needed. This is
Yeah.
where community is needed so that we can quote unquote check one another and listen to one another and say, hey, what if we tried it this way
Yeah.
instead? I think it's something that we can't just remain in our own silos saying, I don't want to be wrong, because at times you will be wrong. It's
Yeah.
just the
Yeah.
nature of the game, and there's no way to do this perfectly. So I think the gift that you've offered is that you had courage to say, I don't necessarily know. How can we figure it out together? Here's what I'm thinking. Let's put our heads together. You know, I think that's the work. I think that's the work, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And just learning not to center on any one perspective, right? And to really
Mm-hmm.
look at us as humans with very, very different experiences. And so how do we honor
Mm-hmm.
those? That's been my goal all along,
Mm-hmm.
is to
Yeah.
not
I
center
definitely
it
think
on
you're
my
doing it for
perspective.
sure.
Huh?
Well, you share your perspective too, but you definitely made a lot of room for other people to share their perspectives as well.
Yeah.
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 Well, any last thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Um, no, but if maybe the only one is, if you have the chance to apply for an in-break residency, go for it, because this has been something that I was telling Dia that I I don't think I go a week without referencing something that I gained from that particular residency, and that was what, 3 seasons ago. So just the wealth of what you're offering, Dia, honestly, to the world, and just I think you give so generously, and what is flourishing as a direct result of that. So yeah,
Mm.
so just I'm excited about all you're doing, and I'm really excited about it. So thank you for having me and to talk about this.
Thank you so much. The feeling is very mutual. Thank you, thank you, thank you.